Chapter 4. Rebecca woke disoriented the next morning. It took her a moment to remember where she was. The arm curled around her body, as she pillowed her head on a muscular shoulder helped. She lay quietly against Nick, watching him sleep as she thought about what he'd told her the night before. In telling her everything he'd done two things. He'd given her something she could use against him, and at the same time, he'd shown her that he trusted her not use it. She could tie him to her without it affecting her. Hell, she'd almost done it last night, albeit unknowingly. Rebecca wondered briefly if she could have relationship with him, knowing that he could do the same to her. She already sensed that she could trust him with her safety, but could she trust him with her heart, her soul? She lay there for a while longer, making her decision, and determining the best course to take in acting on it. She carefully slipped out from under Nick's arm, sliding away from his side slowly in order to keep from waking him. She stepped into the attached bathroom for a moment, before returning to the bedroom. Standing next to the bed, she looked down at Nick as he slept peacefully, unaware of the turmoil in her mind. Second thoughts assaulted her. Was this what she should be doing? Rebecca had already determined that her best option was to trust her instincts. They'd never misled her yet. In order to yield to those instincts, she forced herself to dismiss her doubts and act. She slid back onto the bed, still careful not to wake him. Crawling up over his body, she carefully tugged the blankets down as she softly caressed his body. Running her hands over his skin, she enjoyed the rough texture of the hair on his chest, how it thinned to a narrow line over his abdomen, leading her where she wanted to go. Rebecca trailed her mouth over his stomach, gently kissing the warm flesh, sliding her lips over his tanned skin. As she moved further down, she cupped his balls, gently massaging the sensitive tissue as she lowered her mouth to the growing length above. She licked the soft length, tracing abstract doodles with her tongue, causing it to spasm and grow longer, wider. She sucked the tip of him into her mouth, keeping a gentle suction on the semi-hard point, as she ran her tongue around the rim. Nick shifted slightly under her, moaning her name. "Rebecca kitten," he breathed. God! What a way to wake up. She looked at him through her lashes, his hardening cock still in her mouth. He'd lifted both arms up and dragging the pillows with them, piling them under his head, so he looked down the length of his body and watched her. The undisguised lust on his face encouraged her. She took more of him into her mouth, pulling him in until he filled her mouth and hit the back of her throat. Nick moaned again, struggling to keep pushing himself roughly down her throat. Rebecca worked her mouth up and down over the length him, swirling her tongue around the rim every time she reached the tip. She ran the nails on her hands lightly over the skin on his legs and hips, not scratching him, but adding to the overload of sensations he was already feeling. Nick couldn't take any more. He was close to the edge of his control when he burst into movement. Releasing the pillows, he reached down and pulled Rebecca's mouth off him. He roughly pulled her body up, sliding her bare skin against his until he could capture her mouth with his. He kissed her passionately, possessively, as he lifted her higher against him. He settled her against the length of his body, and slid his hands along her body until he was kneading her breasts, thumbing the dusky nipples until they beaded. He palmed the globes and squeezed gently as she moaned into his mouth. Continuing to make love to her mouth, he caressed one hand down her abdomen, to her cup her mound. He found her hot and wet against him. He slid one finger inside, rubbing the tight nubbin once twice, before moving further back and sinking two fingers deep in her hot moist channel. He pumped them in and out of her, loving the slick heat she'd produced. Nick broke the urgent kiss. "Ride me," he whispered. "Please, kitten." Rebecca was hesitant. She'd never done this before, but when he asked so nicely, she couldn't deny him. She sat up, lifting herself off him enough to fit the tip of him into her opening, before she lowered herself over him, letting the weight of her body push him deep into her body. "Ooh," she sighed, feeling her hips settle against his, pushing him deeper than he had been the night before, stretching her, filling her. She could feel the ripples of pleasure already moving through her. Nick laid his hands on her thighs where they rested on either side of his body and slid them up, gripping her hips, lifting her once, then twice, encouraging her to move over him. Lifting her up and letting himself slide almost all the way out before letting her sink back over him, working his length in and out of her body. After a few strokes, he slid his hands up her body and around her back. He pulled himself up until he was almost sitting, the pillows falling behind his back so that when he moved his hands to cup and play with her breasts, the fallen pillows propped him at an angle he could easily to pull one nipple and then the other into his mouth. He lapped at the hard, sensitive tips with his tongue. "Ah," Rebecca squeaked in surprise when he bit down sharply on one nipple, the shudders starting to race through her body. Nick gripped her hips again and increased the tempo of their thrusts. Not releasing her breast from his mouth, he flicked his tongue over the abused tip, soothing the sting of his bite. Releasing one breast only to capture the other, he maintained the increased pace he'd set between them while suckling hard. Suddenly he bit down again, careful not to pierce the skin. He bit just hard enough that the sting, the contrast of sensations would throw her over the edge into orgasm again. The sudden stinging pain sent Rebecca screaming into the abyss. She lost awareness of anything around her. Only the intense pleasure, the shuddering and squeezing of her body, and the heat of his body against and inside hers existed. The pulsing and gripping of her body around him sent Nick beyond his control, and he exploded, jetting his seed deep inside her. When she collapsed against him, gasping from the intense pleasure, he caught her, gently cradling her body against his chest while she recovered. The bedroom door exploded open, slamming against the wall and bouncing back. Steve raced into the room, searching for the threat to his con. Startled by the intrusion, Nick pulled Rebecca tight against him as he rolled off the bed to the far side of the door. He left her lying on the floor when he stood, careless of his nakedness, and prepared to defend her against the intrusion. "What is it?" Nick demanded from Steve, his nerves on edge waiting for an attack. "I heard screaming and ran to help." Nick ran one hand over his face as if wiping away the last remnants of sleep. "We're fine. Why don't you go back to your coffee and I'll join you soon?" "Yes, sir." Steve backed out of the room, pulled the door closed behind him. Once they were alone in the room again, Nick bent down to check on Rebecca. "Are you all right?" he asked, concerned. "I didn't hurt you when I rolled us onto the floor, did I?" "No, I'm fine." She picked herself up off the floor, a grin spreading across her face. "You have to admit, it's funny." Barely able to hold in her giggles, sat on the edge of the bed and released them, laughing out loud for the first time in ages. Nick, charmed by her laughter, chuckled, shaking his head. "Come on, let's get showered and go have some breakfast," he suggested. "Maybe we should take separate showers. I'm starving, and I suspect we'll get distracted and not get to eat for a long while if we take one together." "You have a point," he acknowledged. "You use this shower, I'll use the one in the hall." He went to the tall dresser and dug through a drawer. He pulled out a pair of shorts and tossed them onto the bed in front of her. "Here's a pair of shorts for you. They've got a drawstring waist, so you should be able to keep them up, and your sweatshirt's hanging on the back of the chair next to you. I'd apologize for not having any underwear for you, but in reality, I'm not sorry." He flashed a leer in her direction. "Be that way," Rebecca said flippantly, gathering up the clothes and heading for the bathroom. "I'll remember it and use it against you later." She grinned over her shoulder before closing the bathroom door, leaving him alone in the bedroom. He gathered clothing for himself and headed down the hall to shower.